Islamic Caliphate, or is just simply the Islamic State since 29th of June 2014, in the context specifically of the post-US withdrawal at the end of 2011. So, in that way we can avoid going over history that's been discussed many times before. But by the end of 2011, it's still just only it's the Islamic State of Iraq, and it's been rolled back significantly in Sunni areas. So, for example, in Anbar and Salah ad-Din and Nainawa, thanks to the Sahwa movement and the Anbar awakening and so on, beginning from 2007 onwards. However, by the end of 2011, so the Islamic State of Iraq as it's then, and it's under the leadership of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has nonetheless consolidated itself around Mosul, using Mosul as a financial base and extorting money from most businesses there every month. And in the meantime, they're still able to conduct low-scale attacks, car bombings and suicide bombings that still kill hundreds of people every month. However, there's broadly, the Sunni insurgency has died down. The broader context of, the Islamic State of Iraq isn't isolated. It comes in this broader context of a Sunni insurgency that either rejects outright or wishes to contest with the post-2003 order, post-Saddam order. So, for example, by the end of 2011, there are still several insurgent brands you can distinguish, Sunni insurgent brands. But the most notable case of a shift from violently opposing the post-2003 order to some kind of acceptance is the Islamic Army of Iraq, which is Salafi in orientation, but had played a significant role in the formation of the Sahwa movement and local Sunni force against the Islamic State of Iraq. And by the end of 2011, the context is that there's the US withdrawal impending, and so the Islamic Army of Iraq feels there's no need to continue fighting, and so it demobilizes at the end of the US withdrawal and forms a political branch called the Al-Iraq al-Sha'bi al-Sunni, or the Sunni Popular Movement, which was most broadly designed to advance Sunni interests, but was clearly pushing a specific goal of a Sunni autonomous region, so analogous to the Kurdistan area. For Kurds, then, the provinces of Anbar, Salah ad-Din, and Nainawa should, ideally, have been Sunni autonomous regions. On the other hand, there are still plenty of other groups. There are other groups that still don't accept the post-2003 order even by the time of the US withdrawal. 1920s revolution brigades, again Sunni Islamist and of a nationalist orientation like the Islamic Army of Iraq, has come to accept by the end of 2011 most broadly the post-2003 order, and many of their members also played a role in the Sahwa. However, the JRTN, or Jaysh Rijal al-Tariq al-Naqshbandiyya, essentially the armed wing of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party under Izzat Ibrahim ad-Duri, remains a rejectionist group, but like the Islamic Army of Iraq, has its own activist wing, Intifada Ahrar al-Iraq, but this is designed to push for so-called thawra or revolution. Other groups that exist don't really have political wings. They don't have clear political wings by the end of 2011. So Jaysh al-Mujahideen is a Salafi grouping, anti-Shia, wants to overthrow the central government. This remains a rejectionist group, and there's no sign of a shift from armed activity to political activity. And then you have Jamaat Ansar al-Islam, which is the latest outgrowth of what was the original Ansar al-Islam in Iraqi Kurdistan. They are jihadi like Islamic State of Iraq, and they talk about things like Khilafah, Caliphate, and very anti-Shia in their discourse. But the only difference is that simply they did not accept the Islamic State of Iraq's claim to be an actual state. And so by the end of 2011, we're still most broadly talking of a group that, with the Islamic State of Iraq, a group that doesn't really have much to show for itself in terms of being in an actual state. Then the US withdrawal happens, and then, of course, things take a turn for the worse. Immediately after the US withdrawal, the Iraqi government that's now been formed under Prime Minister Maliki, there's the arrest warrant against the Sunni Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi. Although this doesn't really prove a decisive point in stoking sectarian tensions within Iraq, it's actually relatively insignificant. But then 2012 comes along, and then the Islamic State of Iraq, which is continuing to fight, launches this Breaking the Walls campaign, which is designed to free veteran prisoners, veteran jihadis who are still in government jails. But still, even then, the overall uptick in there's only a slight uptick in overall violence in 2012. It's only slightly higher in casualty figures than 2011. Only a few hundred more at most. And this is so even as expansion into Syria is beginning or has already begun. So 2011, of course, saw the outbreak of the unrest in Syria, and the Islamic State of Iraq has already played a role in dispatching representatives into Syria to form over the border via this passage, actually, approximately here, from Nainawa into Hasaka province in northeast Syria, played a role in dispatching what would then become Syria's Al-Qaeda affiliate Jabhat al-Nusra, which doesn't publicly announce itself until the start of 2012. And they're not the only group to have Iraqi group to expand into Syria. Jamaat Ansar al-Islam, also a jihadi group, as I'd mentioned, chooses to expand into Syria at this point. A man called Abu Muhammad al-Muhajir, an Iraqi in Jamaat Ansar al-Islam, he plays a role in establishing a training camp for Jamaat Ansar al-Islam in Al-Hawal in Hasaka province, so again around here. And this marks the beginning of the expansion of that brand as well into Syria. But with regards to the Islamic State of Iraq, it's Jabhat al-Nusra. It's ostensibly still an official Al-Qaeda project. Then 2012 sees initiatives by it sees forms of pushes for Sunni autonomy in the provinces that ultimately turn out to be unsuccessful. And then with that perceived failure, and then compounded with additional feelings of now that the US is gone, there's a perceived the Iraqi security forces are perceived to be acting more harshly and reverting to old style tactics of in terms of trying to deal with the problem of insurgency, which more or less hinders local cooperation. Then there's this arrest warrant that appears to target Rafi al-Isawi, another prominent Sunni political figure, and this immediate cause sparks the outbreak of the Sunni Arab protests of 2013 that contrast with the 2011 protests in Iraq, which were modeled on the Arab Spring and focused on non-sectarian grievances like poor electricity provision, corruption, lack of public services, and so on. But these 2013 protests take a distinctly sectarian form, and it focuses on Sunni grievances, most broadly focusing on issues like, for example, the problems with de-Baathification. De-Baathification legislation is perceived as being discriminatory against Sunnis and targeting them and excluding them from jobs and participation in Iraq's political and economic life. And going back to the issue of insurgent groups having their own activist wings, some of them represent themselves in these protests, in the various protest sites. So in Ramadi, Fallujah, Tikrit, Mosul, some in Diyala as well. So, for example, the Islamic Army of Iraq's Sunni Popular Movement shows up in the 2013 protests, and they're specifically pushing, again, this agenda of an idea of an autonomous Sunni region in Iraq. But then the JRTN, the Baathists, also have their Intifada Ahrar al-Iraq set up protest sites, most notably in Tikrit, Jalula, Hawija, and Hawija in Kirkuk. These are all areas of strong Ba'athist influence. And this proves a decisive turning point, because the JRTN, as I'd mentioned, ultimately doesn't care about issues like reforming de-Baathification. They want to restore the Ba'athist state. And so they're looking for a confrontation with the government. And besides this, the Islamic State of Iraq have their own supporters show up occasionally at protest sites like Fallujah and Ramadi. And it's definitely the case that in Fallujah in particular, that the protest organizers really didn't do enough to dissociate themselves from these supporters. They were allowed freely to wave their flags and engage in protest, whereas I think they could have done a bit more to dissociate themselves. The government does, contrary to what's often said, that the government didn't try to address the grievances expressed in these protests. There was an attempt to address it, specifically in that Maliki began working with Saleh al-Mutlaq, who'd previously denounced Maliki as a dictator. He began working with Saleh al-Mutlaq, and he allowed Saleh al-Mutlaq to draft reforms to de-Baathification, so exactly addressing these issues that were were at the heart of the Sunni Arab protests, and for them to be put to Parliament. So this is the spring of 2013. Then an incident happens in Hawija, the facts of which are not necessarily clear even all that now. However, the end result of that was it's a confrontation between JRTN supporters and security forces that culminates in many unarmed protesters being killed, even though, of course, it was clear that, again, as I'd like to stress, the JRTN wanted a confrontation. They weren't interested in actual reform. They want to overthrow the system. And they, at the Hawija site, you could hear slogans like "Ash-Sha'b yurid i'lan al-Jihad." People want the announcement of jihad, And this was before the Hawija massacre, as so to speak, that takes place in April of 2013. And once that happens, violence never goes below the levels of that month. Since then, until now, violence has not been below the levels of April 2013. And it sees renewed insurgent activity by these various brands, including the Islamic Army of Iraq now taking up arms to a limited extent, and the JRTN going all out as well. You having used this confrontation as an excuse to engage in such activities. And meantime, the bill proposing reforms to address Sunni grievances fails because I think more broadly there's a reluctant. I know Maliki and the Dawa might be perceived as being hardline, but in the reality, the Sadrists and so on, I think, are even more hardline on these issues of de-Baathification and so on. 2013, at the same time, Islamic State of Iraq has become ISIS. They've said that Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria is just a front for the Islamic State of Iraq, and so the two should be merged to form the ISIS. But this is a unilateral initiative from Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State of Iraq, on the grounds that since he provided the initial funding and dispatched Jolani into Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, into Syria in the first place, it should be under his command. But then that's rejected by Jabhat al-Nusra. There's a deliberate appeal to Aymen al-Zawahiri of Al-Qaeda, the head of Al-Qaeda, to mediate, and he ruled that the two should be kept separate, but Baghdadi rejected that order, and he says the Dawlat al-Islam is baqiyah, or remaining. And that really marks the definite break at that point. So this is June 2013, the definite break between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I know Al-Qaeda doesn't officially disavow ISIS until February of 2014, but in reality, the de facto break is much earlier. And that becomes clear in the shift in ISIS messaging as they begin expanding in Syria. And seizing control of towns, which they declare to be emirates. Emirates, as we know, are the predecessors to a caliphate, sort of like the emirate of Jarablus in northern Syria. They begin projecting themselves more openly in terms of their goals. But in Iraq, they still don't control territory. They're still investing resources from Iraq into seizing territory in Syria. But in Iraq, they project themselves as all their attacks as revenge attacks in protection of Sunnis, and they project this image of themselves as protectors of the Sunnis. And then despite all this, then you have this Soldiers' Harvest campaign launched by ISIS in Iraq in the summer of 2013 that aims to again bolster the ranks, and it culminates in some very successful prison breaks, like the Abu Ghraib prison break in July of 2013 that was well known, and a more limited prison break at Taji, which meant that many of the old hardened veterans from the captured during the height of the Iraq War and the US occupation end up in the ranks of ISIS. And despite that and the continued rise in violence, the Sunni Arab protests begin to die down as they run out of steam. There's nothing left, no credibility left for them, and and people gradually begin to dissipate. However, then there is then an incident in Anbar in late 2013 where the high-ranking military officers got killed in an ambush, and then it was decided to launch a new sweeping offensive to crack down on ISIS in Anbar. But however, Maliki focuses the attention on the Ramadi protest site, which is still around, but very much smaller than at the beginning of 2013. He says that it's a base for ISIS, although there's really no convincing evidence that points in that direction. Nonetheless, I think that in the context of the 2014 parliamentary elections that were coming up, to try to show himself strong on security would have been a way to appeal to a voting base. And in terms of the Ramadi protest site, it's targeting a Sunni MP, Ahmed al-Alwani, who is admittedly very sectarian. But unfortunately, the crackdown results in the killing of Alwani's brother, the dismantlement of the Ramadi protest site, but leads to widespread local anger. And the government decides to withdraw the armed security forces from the various cities in Anbar. And that allows for ISIS, coordinating with a variety of insurgent groups, to move in and take over Fallujah. And parts of Ramadi as well, so which provokes the beginning of the Anbar conflict in the start of January of 2014. The fighting goes on in Anbar. There's little progress made. Fallujah is not recaptured. There's really actually no major government advance into Fallujah city. And finally, ISIS has continued to expand in Syria, despite the infighting with other rebel groups. And then beginning in by June 2014, we have the familiar event of the fall of Mosul and Tikrit and many other Sunni Arab cities in Iraq, including western Anbar, much of rural of Kirkuk, parts of Diyala as well. Again, these offensives also are initially coordinated between ISIS and other Sunni insurgent groups. The Islamic Army of Iraq, for example, has gone all out, and by their own admission, they coordinated with the Islamic State in this initial rapid wave of summer advances. However, these alliances between ISIS and other insurgent groups quickly dissipates. Fallujah is a more gradual process. When Fallujah fell out of government control, some examples, ISIS along with the Islamic Army of Iraq, the JRTN, Jaish al-Mujahideen, but by June of 2014, it's only ISIS left in the city, and as a further sign of their consolidation of control, they have declared a so-called Fallujah province in September of 2014. The problem is for any of these other factions that want to coordinate with ISIS, and they did in the initial phase, is not really understanding that ISIS considers itself to be an actual state, not a mere group or organization. And then that's, of course, bolstered by this so-called Caliphate Declaration on June 29th, which means that ultimately they don't tolerate other groups, and either those groups should pledge bay'ah or allegiance, or they should leave, or they get subjugated and killed. In Mosul also, initially, it's ISIS, Jamaat Ansar al-Islam, which, as I mentioned, was quite strong in Mosul, and the JRTN. However, again, by less than a month, ISIS gains the upper hand over these groups, and these other groups exercise no influence. It goes particularly badly for Jamaat Ansar al-Islam because of the the overlap in ideology. So if ISIS is actually calling itself a caliphate, it has much better resources. It has much better weaponry. It has contiguous territory. It can make some kind of claim to being a state. Then that will prove appealing to these people in Jamaat Ansar al-Islam who have the same end goal of a caliphate. They look at ISIS and think, or the Islamic so-called now Islamic State or State of the Islamic Caliphate, and they think, no, this is a caliphate, so why not join it? Most of the Ansar al-Islam were based in Mosul and parts of Kirkuk province, and also they were in Tikrit. But by the end of August 2014, at least 90% of Ansar al-Islam has given allegiance to the Islamic State, and the group effectively ceases to exist, and remnants, say, go to places like government-held places like Kirkuk, although there's still a remnant branch surviving in Syria. The reason I go at length to discuss these dynamics is the general pattern that's now emerged by now is that ISIS dominates all the cities that are out of government control. So Fallujah, Western Anbar cities like Al-Qaeda and Rawa and Rutba. I mean, these cities in Western Anbar, it was only ever the Islamic State in the first place. There was no coordination with other groups. Tikrit as well is solely controlled by ISIS. Hawija as well, they pushed out the JRTN. Mosul again, Tel Afar, and so on. And then the other factions have ended up being pushed out to the peripheries at best. But on the other hand, they still, generally speaking, prefer to engage in fighting government forces. Jaish al-Mujahideen actually is a notable exception because they controlled a little town to the north of Fallujah called Al-Qarma, and they were the dominant faction there, beginning from January of 2014. But in August, ISIS moved on that area and had an armed confrontation with them, and forced them out of Al-Qarma, and they just withdrew, partly thanks to tribal mediation, and their fortunes have also been dashed. So the reason to emphasize these relations, I think there's sometimes a mistaken notion that ISIS is in an alliance of convenience, particularly with Baathist insurgents, and then people in turn draw attention to the fact that ex-Baathists, people in Saddam's army, for example, are in the Islamic State. While that's certainly true, I think there's a risk of overplaying that. The Islamic State's model of governance, and if there's internet access here, then I can show you examples of administrative documents that they have issued. My point being that these documents, and I've documented at least 60. I mean, I've looked over 60 administrative documents and translated them. Now, they make it very clear that this is a model of governance very far divorced from Baathism. Yes, it's totalitarian like Baathism, but it's the actual content. I mean, I think it's the content of the curriculum would be. I think most Baathists would feel revulsion at it. For example, Mosul University, and wait, is there a mouse? Anyway, I can show you the original statement later, but I've translated here the notice they issued to Mosul University. And this is very early on in their control of Mosul. And they closed the College of Human Rights, Political Sciences and Fine Arts, Archaeology, Physical Education and Philosophy, and the Department of Management of Tourism and Hotel Institutions, because actually ISIS, what they do is they take over hotels and they make them their real estate, which they either give as accommodation to ISIS fighters or they let out to locals in charging for rent, which makes for a good source of revenue. The point being that there's no way the Baathists or like JRTM would ever accept these kinds of regulations. And when you couple that with the destruction of the shrines in Mosul, like the Prophet Seth and Prophet Jonah, very much which was actually denounced indirectly by JRTN, indicates really that, again, this is really just ISIS going at the Islamic State going at governance alone. This isn't alliance of convenience. So I really think that notion has to be done away with. I think more generally, looking on in the issue of the Sunni community and how they represent themselves in the Iraqi state, there's a huge problem in that the Sunni insurgent groups just generally, although not all of them, Jaish al-Mujahideen is an exception, they do denounce IS by name, but for example the JRTN. The JRTN, for example, put out a statement condemning ISIS's burning of that Jordanian pilot, having burned him alive, but they are in denial about the problem generally, and they don't refer to ISIS by name. They say, oh well, ISIS are followers of Iran. Particularly, I think that's problematic. It shows they're divorced from reality, because Iran is not behind the Islamic State, however much some people like to play that out. So this divorce from reality means that, and coupled with the fact the Sunni political class in Iraq doesn't have any credibility, there's an obvious question where all we have to ask is, who represents the Sunni community now? Is it this Islamic State, which is by all means genocidal against Shia, against Yazidis? If they want to dissociate themselves, and if Sunnis want to dissociate themselves from this and want to denounce it, which is fine, but why so many Sunni political figures and pro-insurgent figures, they don't want to mention this phenomenon by name. They don't want to admit how much they've truly lost out. So really, I think the Iraqi Sunni community as a whole, with the rise of this IS phenomenon that's been devastating economically for them in areas like Mosul, and Tikrit and so on. Tikrit's almost completely depopulated now. Mosul, barely any electricity is coming. Petrol is much more expensive now. It's say at least 1,400 dinars a litre, where it is in Iraq elsewhere it's much lower. Quality of life is deteriorating, living standards, and a whole generation's future. So really the Iraqi Sunni community is in crisis about who represents them, how do they really see themselves vis-a-vis the Iraqi state.
We've just come back from another event, and I've had to listen to this the second time.
No, I went into more detail this time.
Yeah,
you cut me down to 10 minutes last time.
I think he's pretty much covered.
Yeah. We'll look through more documents in the questions.
Every aspect of ISIS, but I think it would be better if we just go on to some questions. It would probably be better than me just giving another half an hour talk. So. Yeah.
So anyone wants to ask me something about ISIS, then or these other groups, let me know. Since you have your hand up.
I think he's got a microphone. He wants to.
No, use a mic.
Hi there. Well, very loud. Just want to say thank you for putting on this event. Very interesting. Very good to have this debate here today. So we all know, firstly, who is orchestrating ISIS, which is, of course, Switzerland. That aside, rather silly joke. My question is referring really to what you say as the Sunnis in Iraq being in crisis. Now, as an observer, as a non-Iraqi, my perspective is limited, but I see the last 10, 12 years, really, the most vexing question in modern Iraqi history, post-2003, is really the issue of who is a Baathist, and what is their relationship to the Baath Party, and you know, essentially whether they had blood on their hands or whether they were linked to people with blood on their hands. Now, the intensity of the violence in Iraq, and particularly Anbar and Nineveh, in the past few months, of course, you know, we've seen in the past 6 months at least 500 members of the Al-Nimra tribe being massacred for quite long-term resistance to the ISIS group. This very intense violence in these Sunni areas, like you say, there's a crisis of identity. And in fact, I would say that Sunni identity is perhaps so fragmented now in Iraq that there really is very little coherent Sunni identity left at all, in fact. Mm-hmm. So my question really is that really for perhaps quite terrible reasons, have we actually moved beyond the debate about Baathism and debathification in Iraq? We're now perhaps in a situation where the question about the current state of Iraq is about ISIS, not really about, or Daesh, or whatever you want to call them. It's not really about debathification anymore at all. Have we moved beyond that?
Yes, the debathification legislation, I mean, it's barely talked, this notion is barely talked about in terms of reforming it. Because, quite right, I mean, not unjustifiably, there is a sense of existential threat coming from IS. I mean, it is a group that wants to kill all Shia or convert them by force or whatever. And so, you know, when in that context, when you feel that under threat like that, then issues like, you know, a political settlement really goes, it's put on the back trail, so to speak, and doesn't gain priority or consideration.
Any from the lady side first? No question?
I wanted to know two things. Were you yourself, as an analyst, surprised at the speed at which ISIS phenomena became so dominant? And secondly, to what do you attribute this particular phenomenal rise in the dominance of ISIS? Is it to do with underlying grievances felt by the Sunni, the alienation of Sunni, etc., or is there something else? Is there an external factor involved in this?
Okay. No, I wasn't surprised by the dominance of ISIS. I think that some people were a bit too keen to overplay the other insurgent groups and say that the JRTN is dominant in Mosul, and I've seen even many months later this notion got played up for an alliance of convenience. But again, looking at the actual administration of Mosul by the Islamic State, it's very clear they're the ones calling the shots. There's no trace. I mean, even in the city charter that ISIS put out immediately after the fall of Mosul, they made clear that besides the end of the Safavid government, so to speak, the current system in Iraq, there is also the era of Mahfism is over, and now is the era of the Islamic State. And so it is a, yes, it's totalitarian like Mahfism, but it is also a model of governance, I think, that would that's very far removed from something that JRTN would like to see. Now, as regards the causes of this, yes, local Sunni grievances have played a role in this, in the sense of that lack of willingness to work with security forces, and also, but I mean, but also, you know, that there are other factors that I mean that I as I tried to emphasize, this issue of, you know, Sunni denialism among insurgent leaders and among those with support bases of the insurgency about the IS phenomenon, and also, of course, mainstream Sunni politicians having little credibility. I mean, leaving aside issues of sectarianism from, say, security forces in Mosul prior to its fall, I mean, was Ufayl al-Najafi doing a good job in governing Mosul? I mean, not really. I mean, he was, again, like most of the Iraqi political elite, largely detached from, you know, the needs of ordinary people in Mosul. But I mean, there's no denying that life now is objectively worse in Mosul than it ever was under the government, leaving aside issues of, you know, harassment at checkpoints or whatever, electricity provision, health, all now much worse than before. I tend not to external factors. What I've in looking at the IS documents and how they administer and how they justify themselves, how they present themselves. I think one has to be a bit careful about just saying they're Wahhabi or Salafi. They have actually distributed texts by Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Wahhabi trend in Syria, for example. They have, but also they in their documents and citations, they're very, unlike Salafis, they're very keen to present themselves as in the framework of the 4 traditional Sunni schools of jurisprudence. So, for example, if they want to condemn a practice on Eid al-Adha, they'll say, well, this is condemned because Imam Shafi, rahimahullah, said this about it, or all the 4 imams agree on point X. So, which is actually paradoxical because, as I say, conventionally they're described as Salafi, but then Salafis are known for giving little weight at minimum to the opinions of the 4 schools of jurisprudence and seeing this as like a wasteful innovation. You've got to go back to the texts, not to the elaborations of ulama. On the other hand, when you talk about external problem, definitely, for example, the issue of influx of, say, foreign fighters from Turkey to Syria in 2013 helped significantly to bolster the group's ranks and gave them military strength, at least inside Syria. I went to Syria, in rebel-held Syria, in December of 2014. I went to Istanbul and then to Gaziantep. I had my tickets, and the Turkish authorities saw them, but asked me no questions about what I was planning or what I was going to do. And then even when I was in Syria, I was with a group called Northern Storm, this rebel group, and the former leader of Northern Storm, he asked me, so did the Turkish authorities ask you anything about why you're here, or where you're going? And I said no. And even when I was at Bab al-Salam, a border crossing going into Syria, I wasn't asked any questions, apart from just saying I'm going for tourism or for press visiting, for press purposes. But he said, but so the former leader of Northern Storm, he said to me then, well, Aymen, don't you think that Turkey is working with the Western countries to dump foreign fighters in Syria so they can get rid of their jihadi problem? Now, of course, that's a conspiracy theory, and I don't think that's Turkey's intent, but there's a great deal of negligence on the part of the Turkish authorities, which has indirectly, at the minimum, facilitated the growth of ISIS in Syria, at least. And, of course, beginning in September, the autumn of 2013, some of these foreign fighters that had come into Syria via Turkey then began coming into Iraq to launch suicide operations and so on. And there's a case to be made that the Turkish authorities turned a blind eye, partly because they thought, oh, well, these foreign fighters, they're going to fight the Kurdish PYD or the Syrian branch of the PKK, so what's the problem? So in that way, that's the number one in terms of the current rise of ISIS being facilitated by a foreign power. Gulf donations, people bring this up, I'm less, I don't really give credence to that because private donations actually play very little role in the Islamic State's financing.
Amir?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for your talk. Okay, so could you talk a bit more about who is backing ISIS and the other Sunni groups? So we've heard Gulf states and private financing, we've heard Switzerland, but anyone else? Also, not just arms and money, but also scholarship.
Okay.
Thank you.
Going actually first about other Sunni insurgent groups. So this latest statement that from the Naqshbandi army or the JRTM that condemns the burning of the Jordanian pilot, they actually refer to the Jordanian pilot as a shaheed or martyr. There's no mention of ISIS by name in this. Again, they say it's all the followers of Iran who do this and so on. But unlike the 1920s revolution brigades, the Naqshbandi army is praising this fighter pilot as a shaheed and carrying out his duty, and whereas the 1920s revolution brigades have said, has questioned why Arab states would participate in this coalition against ISIS, with the airstrikes and so on. And together, when you take that with the JRTN's glowing tribute to King Abdullah, the deceased Saudi king, it's clear that at the minimum, there's some kind of the Naqshbandi army wants to position itself as like the proxy that Jordan and Saudi could back to bolster itself, because they're in a very weak position right now. However much they'd like to brag about revolution, I mean, they've really lost out to ISIS in the battle for the control of the major cities and which brand will be the viable insurgent brand for Sunnis. There's that. On the other hand, with ISIS, as I'd mentioned, I don't see any that kind of external support in terms of financing or so on being having much to do with them. There are a variety of sources of ISIS income. So going back to the aspects of IS administration, let's take to give a sample. If we look at public services, if you look at public services, they have the Diwan al-Khidmat for the Islamic State, or the Services Administration, put out a series of regulations in December on sanitation laws for Mosul. For example, that you can't dumping waste illegally incurs a fine of 25,000 dinars. Every house is to pay a monthly sum of 2,000 dinars in expense for cleaning of waste, and every shop and business is to pay 5,000 dinars monthly. When you combine that also with, for example, the fact that the government, to maintain influence in Mosul, still pays civil servants and teachers their salaries, and ISIS takes a slice of that, it's very easy to see how ISIS becomes self-sufficient internally. Unlike, say, other jihadi groups. For example, there's a jihadi group in Syria, or there was, but it's since joined Jabhat al-Nusra, Syria's Al-Qaeda affiliate, was called Suqur al-Iz, founded by Saudi foreign fighters. They were largely dependent on Gulf donations, but when that dried up, they subsumed themselves under Jabhat al-Nusra. So I'm not saying that, Gulf financing or Gulf vindication, and, I'd certainly, if you say that the Gulf states don't have say Saudi Arabia doesn't have ideological credibility to fight ISIS because of overlap in how they govern, anti-Shiism, destruction of shrines and beheadings and so on, then yeah, that's an absolutely valid point. And again, and in terms of other non-IS jihadi groups, it's certainly valid to talk about Gulf financing as playing a role in their proliferation. But IS, no, not so much.
Thank you very much for the enlightening talk. I'm well informed now because I had different ideas, and that's an eye-opener for me. One little thing that hits me in the head about this morning's news was that there are going to be 3,000 fighters which are going to be trained by the American army, and that was a different group mentioned, and they're against the Syrian president, of course. So they're going to gang up against the Syrian president. So is there a totally different group to all this, or is there any basis?
You mean you're talking about the Syrian rebels? I mean, you're wondering if they're...
I think they call themselves IF or something like that.
Oh, Islamic Front. Well, okay. Well, the Islamic Front is a bit complicated because in this Aleppo... So actually, the group I embedded with in Syria, Northern Storm, was Islamic Front. It's part of that coalition. But in Aleppo province, they've since rebranded themselves the Levant Front or the Shami Front, which has also included a Western-backed group called Harakat Hizm, which of course got routed from Idlib by Jabhat al-Nusra. I personally don't think that kind of strategy works. This idea that you just train someone from the outside and insert them back in and hope they'll take on the Islamic State. But yes, precisely many Syrian, and there's also been hope, say, that like the Southern Front or rebels in the south of Syria, in Der'a, for example, bordering Jordan, where there's no ISIS presence, there's a hope that they could be a force to take on ISIS, but I would say that no, that's completely mistaken. I don't believe in this idea that you can just train a proxy force from outside and insert them. And for many rebels, yes, the priority is to fight the regime. They don't see this. They think they overthrow the regime first, then we'll fight ISIS. At least they're getting war weary of fighting ISIS because they've been, for example, rebels had very heavy fighting with ISIS in Deir ez-Zor province in eastern Syria, but by July they got completely subjugated. So in Deir ez-Zor province is now just the regime and ISIS. So yeah, I'm very skeptical of notions of a rebel army that could take on ISIS, and really, I think part of the narrative that rebel supporters would have is they would say that well, ISIS got kicked out of most of northwest Syria, like Idlib and Latakia and so on, by rebels in January of 2014, but a lot of that was strategic withdrawal. The town I went to, Azez, ISIS withdrew from that strategically because it was cut off from the rest of their territory. So a lot of false narratives that go on about rebel effectiveness in fighting ISIS, and I actually think you'd have to have a large ground troop force to work directly with them in combat if you do talk about a rebel army to push back ISIS.
How much of the involvement does the Baathists have in the ISIS, especially when they won in Mosul?
Right.
Militarily, is it were they the main force behind the winning of ISIS or not?
Okay, so the question is this a relation? I mean, the question that I'd pose analytically is this a relationship of codependence where each side depended on the other and it was an essential relationship for the taking of Mosul, or was it more actually the other insurgent groups riding off a IS spearheaded offensive? And I'm actually more inclined to the latter, considering the speed with which ISIS quickly got the upper hand over its rivals in Mosul. Then I mean, my mother's family is from Mosul, and I asked about one of my relatives about the JRTN. Do they have any influence? They said they're present, but they have no influence. Some of them gave bay'ah, some of them fled, some of them were arrested. And I say what ISIS is doing now in Mosul, it's exactly mirroring Raqqa education regulations. Although there's been some problems recently because a guy called Zu al-Qarnayn, who is an Egyptian of German nationality, who heads the IS education administration in Nineveh, they've had troubles implementing the curriculum. They're trying to get the so-called repentance of teachers to follow through. But no, Baathism. Baathism is a very, I think it's an overplayed thing. Yes, as I mentioned, there are people in IS who've had, previous history in the Saddam regime, but that doesn't mean a secret alliance between Baathists and IS. I mean, the relationship between IS and other groups is very clear. It's
so are you saying that Baathists, the military force, did not play any role in the?
They did play a role, but they weren't. I see it more as of riding the back of IS spearheaded success. They'd hope that with the fall of it, even if it's IS leading it, they hope they could gain something out of it. Part of the problem is, I think, that people like Athil Najafi played disinformation, and he claimed that, IS would withdraw from eastern Mosul and would give authority to the JRTN, but that never happened. It's definitely an overplayed thing.
Just to follow on from that, do you think that there were a lot of tactical mistakes by many who made the biggest tactical mistakes in losing Mosul? So obviously the government played a role when it withdrew earlier on, because of the way that the generals played. The Kurds played a role in the loss of Mosul, and obviously Mosul seemed to be the sort of accelerant for ISIS's growth, if you like.
Yeah.
So were there what were the major tactical mistakes that may have prevented Mosul from falling?
I think Mosul's fall, the actual event of it, and in terms of the performance of the government forces, was the culmination really of ISIS and its predecessors hacking away at the structure of the security forces in Mosul in particular. I mean, with so many relentless attacks going on, it causes morale loss. Soldiers may decide they want to stay off duty, and they'll give their commander a portion of their salary, and they don't show up for their postings. Even today, many accounts go and claim that Mosul was a rout of 30,000 soldiers and police from the city by a small band of IS fighters. that's a myth in my view. It was in reality, the numbers of security forces in Mosul who were there by the time ISIS launched its final offensive that led to the fall of the city. It was much smaller than 30,000. I mean, numbers of brigades would have only been at most at half of their supposed number because of the ghost soldier phenomenon and so on. So there's government mistakes, Maliki's own monopolizing the security forces and corruption and so on. It's been endemic in Iraq since 2003. This has all contributed to the decline of the conventional security forces, which is why militias of the Hashid al-Sha'bi have so readily filled the gap in terms of manpower, that is.
What do you see the role of Hezbollah and Iran in opposing ISIS? And what do you think the fortunes of ISIS are for the medium and long term?
Well, in Syria, I don't see it as playing any kind of significant role in the rolling back of IS. I mean, the regime's fight is the Assad regime, backed by Hezbollah and Iran and so on. Its fight is mainly on securing Western Syria, and this is all quite far removed from IS territory. People often talked about the regime, actually, in this context I should mention that people often said, oh, well, the Assad regime didn't target IS in airstrikes, this played a great role in their growth. What I would actually say in response to that is that, the Assad regime has always had a manpower problem, which has meant that they have, say, very few ground forces in Raqqa province where IS has come to center itself. So what's the point in launching an airstrike on IS in Raqqa if you can't follow up with ground forces, because IS could just melt away into the civilian population, and then so that in that sense I don't buy this idea that's often peddled that the regime contributed deliberately and has helped in great deal by not hitting IS targets. There are issues of practicality there and so on. But at the same time, as I don't see Hezbollah in Syria, for example, as playing much of a role because they're simply not fighting IS. IS's priorities are elsewhere. Hezbollah's priorities help to secure Aleppo, and that's a fight between the rebels and the regime. I follow many regime paramilitaries like Syrian Hezbollah. I know the commander of the National Ideological Resistance, for example, which is a Syrian Hezbollah brand, but they're not involved in fighting IS. It's the priority is Western Syria. In Iraq, there's a case to be made in contrast that something had to be done, and Westerners often complain about the Iranian influence that the US is losing Iraq to Iran, but you have to ask but at the same time, every time I see this complaining, there's no solution offered to it. The fact is, Iran is Iraq's neighbor. Iran stepped in immediately when Mosul fell. They didn't dither like the West, and the West doesn't have ground forces in Iraq to help rebuild the security forces. So, I myself have strong reservations about it. I share Ayatollah Sistani's stance on militias. I believe in, the reconstitution of a regular army and police force and so on. But at the same time, I don't buy all this moaning that, the Shia militia is the exact equivalent of ISIS and, and all this moaning without any practical policy proposals to deal with this.
But in terms of how do you see the end game?
The end game, I don't see it as leading to the in the near term, at least, the retaking of places like Mosul and Tikrit and so on from IS. And I think IS can play on that the problem of militification, which has been in a way been encouraged by Iran, particularly with supporting the likes of Asayib al-Haq and Badr and Kataib Hezbollah, and the creation of all these mirror fronts like Harakat al-Nujaba and so on. That this doesn't it just lets IS play on fear and say, we can protect you from these people who have committed abuses. Although again, I don't buy the idea it's the equivalent of ISIS, but they have committed abuses, and IS can play on that narrative and say, well, we're here to protect you.
Any questions from the lady side?
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much for the good speech. That's what really we need. My question goes to what is your view about the future? what do you think, what would happen? How did this problem would be solved? And probably what I think is, after all these wars in this area, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Turkey, in Iraq, I feel there is an aim after the war. After the war is finished, we are now busy with the war. Then after the war is finished, we think, oh, the problem is solved. But there is some other problems arising from all these wars. What do you think all these, how do you connect them?
To give a short answer, to put it in short, the Islamic State slogan, Baqiya wa tatamaddad, or remaining and expanding, they might not be so much, say, tatamaddad in Iraq these days, but they certainly are Baqiya in that they have control over all these major cities that have fallen out of government control, and there's been no real progress on that front. And the same is true of Syria. There's no sign of local opposition that can really challenge IS in a place like Raqqa or in the Deir ez-Zor towns along the Euphrates and so on. And partly of that is a failing in Syria, at least. That's partly a failing of the opposition, in that you have to ask yourself why Syria, when it was so unstable as a country, when it became independent, why the Ba'ath Party has ruled it, the Assad dynasty has ruled it for 4 decades. This problem of rampant localization, and the sense that IS, so taking the question of IS and, say, other Syrian rebels who might be considered as a force to retake areas in Syria from IS. IS, one advantage they have is that it's one group. They bring a sense of order to these Syrian towns, which other rebels couldn't, because they were also hopelessly divided among themselves, and it allowed for an atmosphere of lawlessness and chaos. And now you're seeing the same kind of problem in Libya with the expansion of the Islamic State in Cyrenaica in eastern Libya and in Tripoli. It's the same kind of... IS can thrive as much in an atmosphere of chaos, as well as, leaving aside sectarian dynamics. So really, I don't see much of an end game for the near future. I mean, yes, even if Iraq is able to regain Mosul and Tikrit and so on, well, Tikrit is largely destroyed and depopulated. It'll take a long time to rebuild, if ever within, say, my own lifetime or a lifetime of the rest of this audience. Syria is even more problematic. Which force is there to retake these areas like Raqqa from the Islamic State? I don't see any. So yeah, I'm very pessimistic about this, and this is why I say that, even if you don't want to say the Islamic State is expanding, they are certainly remaining.
Yeah, in terms of the fall of Mosul, do you think that the local population, did they submit due to fear, or do you think they actually have significant support?
I think that, in Mosul, there was, I think, a sense of welcome among many residents. Felt, oh, well, ISIS are dismantling the checkpoints, and we can move freely now about the city and so on. And there was also a sectarian atmosphere that had evolved in Mosul, in anti-Shiism, for example, over the many years. And you see the consequence that Mosul and Tel Afar, these places, are completely depopulated of Shia now. It's difficult to say really what... difficult to generalize from a city of 1 million people about how they feel now about IS. What you can say is, again, going through all these documents I compile and so on, you do get the sense that life is worse there now than it was under the government. And do a lot of people realize that? Undoubtedly, but I'm reluctant to extrapolate too much on limited data. I mean, my family don't support my mother's side of the family, it's from Mosul, don't support Dola, but I can't the Islamic State. But I can't take that alone, or from like-minded people, to then say that most Moslawis are actively opposed to IS. But certainly, yeah, you can say that there's a reign of fear as well, created by these harsh punishments the Islamic State imposes. crucifixions. The same in Raqqa as well. Crucifixions, shootings, public executions in the square with shootings or beheadings and the like.
You mentioned how ISIS took over the area, dominated, and then established discipline and government and some sort of order.
Yeah.
And also to perpetuate their rule.
Mm-hmm.
They have administration and all these sort of things. If you look at Taliban, the way they moved, and again the same situation, they moved very swiftly from Pakistan to Afghanistan. And from where the ISIS came also, it looks like they came from, as you said, it was facilitated in some way or the other from Turkey, Syria, etc. And some support from within. This sort of similarity is there. And then if you look further on, I mean, Taliban has been there for about 30, 40 years almost now. And ISIS is beginning now. And as you say that you don't see any end and you are, and as they are planning to stay there, and you think that they will be staying there for a while. And that as the situation has been in Afghanistan, then there are many similarities in these things. How do you see this, and what is the background of Taliban, and is there any background of ISIS and any similarities, any links, any ideological or even tactical study before launching this sort of campaign?
Actually, the issue of the Taliban and IS is very interesting because the Taliban, of course, declares itself to be an Islamic emirate, which I'd mentioned that IS had declared emirates in Syria, like the Emirate of Jarablus, when they first began seizing control of some towns. And the emirate is the predecessor to the caliphate. So the Taliban, to whose emir, Mullah Omar, the Al-Qaeda has allegiance, and even some jihadi factions in Syria. There's a group called the Imam Bukhari Battalion of Uzbek fighters whose allegiance is to the Taliban. They firmly reject the IS caliphate. In many ways, actually, the IS proves itself more modern than the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban went to lengths to ban girls from going to school, for example. IS doesn't ban girls from going to school. They enforce gender segregation, but they don't deny girls the right to an education. Similarly, the Taliban destroys them banning, weather forecasts because they're supposed sorcery and so on. It's a much more primitive model than IS, and I actually even think that in some cases the Islamic State proves itself a bit more modern than some paranoid types in the West, because if you look at the administrative documents they have, at one of them is a timetable of vaccinations for children. Let's see, wait, it is here. Specimen 1M, vaccinations table for child, which if we click the original link, it is here, issued by the IS Diwan al-Siha, or the health department. Oh, is it not? Might be frozen.
Just turn the laptop, it's quite small.
All right. Should we do just?
That's coming up.
Oh, it's coming up.
Is it? One of the best ways to do this function.
Extend. You could do it again. There you go.
Oh, there it is. There it is. The Islamic State. This is a vaccine timetable issued for the by the Diwan al-Siha of the Dola of the Islamic State in Aleppo province, and it's a full timetable that actually differs very little from the program of vaccinations by the Syrian government. my point being that there are anti-vaccination people in the West, and if shame on them if even IS can understand the need for children to be vaccinated. So yeah, that goes back to my point that I think the IS and Taliban, yes, they're both going for the ultimate same end goal. Just IS took the initiative and declared its caliphate already, and has moved beyond notions of an emirate or emirates. So in that regard, but in many ways they are much more modern, and they're much more modern, so to speak, than the Taliban.
I think final question from the front.
I just wanted to also add a question. Look, given the fact that we have Boko Haram in Nigeria, we have ISIS in Libya, in Syria, and in Iraq. Now, and given the fact that they actually are exhibiting extreme cruelty as probably a strategic way of establishing themselves, do they see themselves as having a long-term presence? And if they see themselves as having a long-term presence, do they see themselves as coexisting? Because if you can't defeat them, if you can't get rid of them, are they going to kind of coexist or have some kind of a political role? Do they have an agenda of becoming a political force?
Who, the Islamic State or these forces combined?
Yes.
No, combined, yes, but that would be under IS alone in terms of... Again, IS's agenda is that it's not enough to say you like Dola. You have to pledge allegiance to Dola, which is actually why there's been some controversy in Gaza about some group called Jamaat Ansar al-Dola. No, there's been a controversy about a group in Gaza called Nusra al-Maqdisiyah, which appears to be a front group for a jihadi group that doesn't want to that wants to show sympathy for IS but doesn't want to pledge allegiance. No, in terms of a political project, it's IS in terms of how it, by its very essence, can only view other entities as being unacceptable, and they have to be subsumed under IS. Boko Haram, actually, which you mentioned, is interesting because it seems to be there seems to be some signs that they might be leaning towards Islamic State. For example, in one of their recent media releases, they used an Islamic State nasheed, Ummati qad laha fajran, which means my ummah, a dawn is looming or has loomed. And they referred to child recruits as Ashbal al-Dawla, Cub Scouts of the state. And the question is, does Dawla refer to a supposed self-declared Islamic State in Nigeria, or are they trying to play themselves as being part of the Islamic State? It's an interesting question where we're going to have to wait for more evidence to come out over time, but it's certainly an interesting case.
Okay, I think we'll end there. Salawat.